Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Hasten, a correspondent for JNS News. I am here in Jerusalem with Alex Traiman, the CEO of JNS. We are here in our historic biblical heartland, the heartland of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. Thanks so much for joining us. Let's get to the news. Alex, top story over the weekend, Secretary of State Blinken, Antony Blinken, issued a reversal, if you will, on the Pompeo doctrine. Now, if you remember, Mike Pompeo in 2019, the Secretary of State of the United States of America under President Donald Trump, he issued a statement saying that the communities, the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria, were not illegal per se under international law. Over the weekend, Blinken seemed to reverse that policy and say, yes, in fact, according to the Biden administration, those communities in Judea and Samaria are, in fact, illegal.
On settlements, we've seen the reports, and I have to say we're disappointed in the announcement. It's been long-standing U.S. policy under Republican and Democratic administrations alike that new settlements are counterproductive to reaching an enduring peace. They're also inconsistent with international law. Our administration maintains a firm opposition to settlement expansion, and in our judgment, this only weakens, doesn't strengthen Israel's security.
I'm going to read here a quote here by Mike Pompeo in response after finding out that Blinken had gone ahead and reversed the Pompeo doctrine. He said, Judea and Samaria are rightful parts of the Jewish homeland, and Israelis have a right to live there. President Biden's decision, of course, it all comes down to the president, to overturn our policy and call Israeli settlements illegal will not further the cause of peace. It rewards Hamas for its brutal attacks on October 7th and punishes Israel instead. These Israeli communities are not standing in the way of peace. Militant Palestinian terrorism is. Again, that's former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. So he had his whole policy, and he did a lot of good things for the Jewish people in the state of Israel under the Trump administration. And in one fell swoop, over the weekend, after a terror attack, nonetheless, we'll get to that also, the Biden administration and Secretary Blinken override the policy on Judea and Samaria.
Yeah, Mike Pompeo came with a landmark policy shift in the United States when he determined correctly that the obstacle to peace in the Middle East are not Jews living in suburban houses in Judea and Samaria, which are the original biblical territories where most every biblical story that you read took place. And rather, here now, John Kirby, who was the one of the spokespersons in the White House, over the weekend said that, in fact, it was the Trump administration, it was Pompeo, who was inconsistent with many administrations that have all held that settlements are illegal under international law. So he reversed that policy. The fact that they're doing it during a war is very, very difficult to understand. The whole fear in Israel about the creation of a Palestinian state is that terror attacks like October 7th would be launched from that territory if the IDF wasn't there. And that's exactly what happened in Gaza. Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip. It became the pilot project for the independent Palestinian entity. And for years, it was just used as a terror haven. So this is exactly why Jews were very suspect about the whole Oslo and two-peace process, the two-state solution peace process. And so now, when all the fears have been realized in the worst way, Blinken and the Biden administration are turning the tables, and it's just part of a number of different policies that the administration has enacted in the last several weeks, as Israel still has troops on the ground inside Gaza fighting for their lives and the future of the Jewish people, that have really turned the tables on Israel's policy, and particularly on Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria.
I mean, this would seem to be a reward for Hamas. As you said, we're in the midst of a war here, whether it's reversing the policies on Judea and Samaria, whether it's obsessively calling for a two-state solution. This, essentially gets Hamas what they want, which is, well, firstly, they want the state of Israel to be destroyed, but not having to go through all of the work and essentially be
it's part of the stages formula. We'll take what we can get now, and then we continue the conflict. Right. That one of the reasons why Palestinians never accepted Israel's offers for a two-state solution in the past is because Israel demanded that whatever solution was reached be the end of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's something that the Palestinians could never accept. They never wanted to accept that. So I think that the big question, though, is how is Israel going to respond to this? If this was just happening in a vacuum, that would be one thing. But we already see the Biden administration putting sanctions on Jews that live in Judea and Samaria. There was another executive order which called on the U.S. government to examine which armies are operating under international law. And if, for example, the IDF was supporting or defending Jewish lives in Judea and Samaria, and the Biden administration says that, well, that's illegal, then all of a sudden the United States may say that under its law, it's not allowed to provide weapons or aid to the IDF. So there's a lot happening. And the question is, and also the other more important part is that the Biden administration is now exploring whether they would recognize Palestinian statehood, as we've discussed in the past. So you see a pattern here developing, and the question is, how is the Israeli government going to respond? What leverage do they have to prevent all this from taking place or to reverse some of this? And the first step that we're starting to see is that Republicans are standing up, not just Pompeo, and are attacking the Biden administration for making this policy decision. All of this is being done through executive order. And we had here that Mike Johnson, who is the Speaker of the House, he wrote that the Jewish people have a historic and legal right to live in the land of Israel, including in Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland. It is an absolute disgrace the Biden administration would issue this decision, especially as Israel fights terrorists on multiple fronts that seek Israel's destruction. And as more than 130 hostages remain in Gaza, the Biden administration must stop undermining Israel and facilitating efforts to delegitimize Israel. It is misguided and unconscionable.
Yeah, no, he's absolutely right. It's absolutely misguided, and it's unbelievable, especially now during war. A lot of people are saying that this is being done for political gain because this is an election season, the U.S. Going to elections in November, and Biden perhaps pandering to some of his more, I guess, left-wing or extremist left-wing or woke, or perhaps some of the Arab communities in Michigan, pandering to them, trying to get their votes. A lot of them are upset, saying that they're going to stay home in November. They won't necessarily vote for Trump, but perhaps they won't vote for Biden either because they're upset. They feel like he's being too pro-Israel. So you have, it seems like every time we take the air here, every single week, there's another policy which tries to undo what the Trump administration accomplished. I remember Pompeo also, in the same breath there, he decided to come out with a statement saying Israeli products made in Judea and Samaria are considered to be part of Israel. He said that BDS was anti-Semitism. So a lot of good things, a lot of positive things for the state of Israel. How will we respond now? That's a very good question because, again, as you said, we are depending on the U.S. arms. At the same time, how much can we take? How much more of these policies where they're going after certain citizens of the state of Israel based on the geography or accusations of violence? Some of them I read this week that out of this, I think it's the 7 people who the UK sanctioned, so-called settlers, residents of Judea and Samaria. Only one of them had a suspected criminal background. The other 6 weren't even on the radar in terms of the Israeli police authorities. So whether it's the US, the UK, France, the EU, or others, everyone seems to be joining forces here against Israel, which is fighting a defensive war of survival against a brutal, evil Hamas terrorist regime, which carried out a massacre and raped and murdered men, women, and children on October the 7th. It's unbelievable how, especially now, this is in the news.
And the U.S. has already intimated that it's going to come down with a second wave of individuals that it's going to sanction. And the Netanyahu administration believes, and it's already been reported, that the U.S. is considering specifically putting sanctions on Israeli ministers,
right,
including Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister. I think it's interesting. They have really reversed so many of the policies of the Trump administration, which by and large made things a lot safer here in the Middle East. They've restored funding to the Palestinian Authority. They tried to reopen up a consulate towards the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem. That was fortunately stopped, but they're basically trying to undermine everything that the Trump administration did for Israel during that term. And one of the authors of a lot of those policies during the Trump administration was David Friedman, who was the U.S. ambassador to Israel And with regards to this reversal of the Pompeo doctrine and declaration that the United States now sees once again settlements as illegal, Friedman wrote, Blinken is 100% wrong. I researched this for over a year with many State Department lawyers. There is nothing illegal about Jews living in their biblical homeland. Indeed, Undersecretary of State Eugene Rostow, also the dean of the Yale Law School, who negotiated UN Security Resolution 242, which is the one that called for the beginnings of the peace process, stated that Israel has the best legal claim to Judea and Samaria. And he went on to say that to announce this in the middle of a war and when the Jewish Sabbath had already begun is unconscionable.
Yeah, I spoke to Professor Eugene Kontorovich yesterday for an article on JNS.org exactly about this topic. And he said to me that in reality, this goes back to pre-Ronald Reagan, the U.S. president back in the 80s. Before Reagan, under the Carter administration, they deemed so-called settlements, communities in Judea and Samaria as being illegal. Reagan reversed that, and the Trump administration decided, no, we are going with Reagan. Pompeo said, we are going with Reagan. And now, according to Kontorovich, that what they've done now, essentially, this is a even worse situation than under Obama, under Clinton, all those policies in regard to Judea and Samaria. This takes us back way back to the 70s. But you mentioned Israeli safety, and this gets us to our next topic. Yesterday, Prime Minister Netanyahu convened his cabinet to talk about Israel's plan for a Rafah operation. That is the last Hamas stronghold there in southern Gaza on the border with Egypt. And just to give you a little bit of what Prime Minister Netanyahu said, he said that the goals of the operation are, number one, is to destroy the remaining Hamas battalions in Rafah. Number two, there's the issue of humanitarian assistance. Already talked about safe passages for the citizens there in Gaza. Again, we've talked about it before, but in my opinion, I still think the humanitarian assistance should be to the south towards Egypt, not back towards to the north areas, which the IDF already cleared out of terrorists. And you also mentioned that once Israel undertakes the last battle, if you will, in Rafah, it would be an issue, would be the time frame would be weeks and not months until the IDF achieves the victory. However, a possible hostage negotiation or resolution there, some kind of ceasefire, temporary ceasefire, that could delay this operation in Rafah, which is a little bit disheartening. The fact that we have the momentum right now, yes, soldiers are being killed, unfortunately, but Israel is perhaps within weeks of winning the war in the south. That could be put on hold now, not judging the families who are, want their loved ones back. And of course, we all want the hostages to return, but this kind of deal could in fact put a delay on this plan announced yesterday for a battle there in Rafah.
When you talk about Rafah, Rafah is the southernmost city in the Gaza Strip. It borders against Egypt. And when the war started, the IDF advanced its military campaign by working from the north to the south. As they were going, the United States put a lot of pressure on Israel to allow for humanitarian corridors to let civilians, residents of Gaza, move toward the south out of harm's way. So as the military operation has proceeded, almost all of Gazan residents have moved towards the south. Now, of course, in addition to residents, we know that terrorists migrated to the south. We also know that hostages were carried along to the south on these humanitarian corridors as well. They were dressed up like Muslim women and smuggled to the south. So now, Israel's really succeeded in pushing all the way to the south. They've destroyed 18 out of 24 of the Hamas's organized battalions, and they said that destroying the battalion means killing or injuring more than 50% of the organized battalion. So that's about 2/3. 3/4 of the job is already done. And as the rest of them have pushed to the south, now they're all in Rafah. But so are maybe close to 1 million residents of Gaza also in the Rafah area. So the remaining terrorists and the hostages are among this entire groundswell of residents that are now in Rafah. So the United States has been putting a lot of pressure on Israel, saying, well, you can't go into Rafah because there's too many civilians there. So they push Israel to come up with plans that would allow for the residents that are now in Rafah to be able to shift to other places so that the IDF can go in and reduce collective civilian casualties. But what's going to be the problem? The problem is that the same way that terrorists use the humanitarian corridors to slide down to the south and get into Rafah, they'll use those same methods to get out of Rafah. And ultimately, it could really expand the fighting, because if the terrorists and the hostages that are now in Rafah now can distribute themselves to other parts of the Gaza Strip, it makes the military operation much more difficult.
Yeah, and that is well documented, that Hamas is disguising themselves as civilians and is going wherever the IDF declares areas to be safe zones. They're embedding themselves within the civilian population. I mean, they've carried out basically every crime imaginable since the start of this whole thing. And they've been doing this, of course, for 20 years, firing rockets, hiding behind their own civilians, firing their rockets at Israeli civilians. And, I would call on the world. Make Egypt open their border. This is the only military situation, war ever, at least in modern times, where other countries aren't coming to the aid of the people who are trying to flee a battle zone. It's absolutely despicable. And instead of putting pressure on communities and preschools in Judea and Samaria, the Biden administration should be putting pressure on the Egyptians to finally open their border once and for all.
Well, you can understand why the Egyptians don't want the Gazans, and
nobody does.
And that's exactly why Israel has a problem with them. Egypt doesn't want that problem. Now, it doesn't mean that Egypt is the only solution. That's not the only path out of Gaza. There could be large boats that could be brought off the shores of Gaza. There's an airport in the south of Israel, the Ramon Airport, and a tent city could be set up over there as they work to try to get Gazans to leave. If diplomatic arrangements could be made for countries to absorb Gazan citizens. But right now, it's not just Egypt that says no Gazans. There's not one country in the world right now that's saying that they would even be willing to accept a single Gazan. But in addition to this question about where the refugees go, and in addition to the question about whether Israel can safely launch an operation in Rafah, is the question of the hostages. And there are ongoing negotiations right now. The month of Ramadan is coming up in the Islamic calendar, and there's a lot of threats that if the fighting continues over Ramadan, that we might see explosion of violence also inside Israel proper, in Judea and Samaria, inside Jerusalem, other places, which has historically been the case. Ramadan is the Islamic holy month, is a holy month for killing Jews in Israel.
Really, really holy there.
Yeah. And, there seems to be a fear of continuing the fighting during Ramadan, and also maybe an opportunity to get some hostages back. And so potential frameworks and what's being reported that there might even be a 6 week pause in the fighting in order to get back about 40 women and children that are still held hostage inside the Gaza Strip, and also in return for the freeing of Palestinian prisoners sitting in Israeli jails. Prime Minister saying that even if there is a temporary pause in the fighting, that the Rafah operation will continue to be launched even after such a pause in the fighting.
Yeah, I want to talk about Ramadan, but I think we should mention at this point, we talked about how Egypt doesn't want to take in the Arabs who live in Gaza. There was an image, I think, somewhere on social media where in Saudi Arabia, I guess people are getting ready for Ramadan, there was somebody who waved a PA or a Palestinian flag in Mecca, and automatically the Saudi officials surrounded this person and grabbed the flag away. I think it just shows you where the rest of the Arab world is, whether, number one, they don't want to have anything to do with the Arabs in Gaza. They want to keep them there as pawns against Israel. And on the other hand, you could have a situation where some of these so-called moderate Arab states, Israel has an agreement already with the UAE, Bahrain, and the rest of them, such as Saudi Arabia, perhaps they don't want to be seen as being in cahoots in any way, shape, or form with the PA or Hamas.
I think it's important to look at how the Saudis deal with their holy sites versus how holy sites are treated here in Israel, right? This was at the Kaaba, the site of the pilgrimage in Mecca, and it's not just Palestinian flags. Saudis don't allow for political statements and flags to be waved in what is considered to be a Muslim holy site. On the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which is the holiest site to Judaism, but it's being commonly referred to as the third holiest site in Islam. There's a lot of debates about whether that's actually the case, but in any case, what happens on the Temple Mount, the most obscene incitements to violence, we saw in 2021, there was a gigantic Hamas banner, which was hung on the Temple Mount. It was up there for a couple of weeks. It's used as the staging ground for vitriolic anti-Semitism against the Jewish people. And I think that Israel should take a look at how Saudi Arabia deals with their holy sites and hold holy sites in Israel to the same standard.
Yeah, no, if something like this would happen on the Temple Mount and an Israeli policeman would intervene, it would be front page headlines in the New York Times and every other publication in the world, ripping Israel for not giving freedom of religion, freedom of prayer, or whatnot. Yet the Saudis, they know how to take care of business when something goes awry, when something isn't to their liking. But speaking of Ramadan, we have this period. It starts March the 10th. We have this period which yearly, as you mentioned, annually has been a hotbed of terrorism directed at Israel. Somehow a holy, peaceful month has been hijacked by those who want to carry out attacks against the state of Israel. So Israeli leadership now debating in terms of the policies in regard to prayer on the Temple Mount. Should we allow everyone to pray on the Temple Mount? Should it be Israeli Arabs? Should it be Jerusalemites, Arabs with identification, blue ID cards? Should Arabs from Judea and Samaria be allowed on the Temple Mount?
So age also.
Age, yeah. Over 45, they're talking about under 16, all different types of ideas, and our leaders are arguing over this.
And limiting the overall number of people that are allowed up on the Temple Mount.
President Isaac Herzog addressed this issue the other day. He said, Israeli President Isaac Herzog, I make it clear to the international community, of course, to our Muslim brothers and sisters in Israel and around the world, that Israel is always and will always maintain freedom of worship and religion in Jerusalem, of course, and in all religious sites around the country, and definitely on the Temple Mount and mosques, of course, pending security considerations and challenges. So the president making it clear that there will be some sort of accommodation for Muslims. Ironically, as you know, Jews can never pray on the Temple Mount, even though somehow it's supposed to be open for all religions. Jews don't pray on the Temple Mount. But what do you see in terms of the agreement, or what do you feel is going to happen when Ramadan rolls around here just another 2 weeks? You have Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir saying that they need to clamp down on Hamas supporters, not allow them onto the holy site. He wants to limit participation in Ramadan services as much as possible. And it seems like the president is taking a little bit more lenient approach, trying to be more accommodating.
Well, when Hamas launched this war on October 7th, they said they were launching it for two reasons. Number one was the Temple Mount, freedom of worship.
Most important.
Right?
Yes.
Number two was the Palestinian prisoners. And the idea that Israel should give in to Hamas's demands when they have historically used the Temple Mount and used the month of Ramadan as a time and a space for inciting violence and committing violence against Jews, we're in the middle of a war here. And Israel has to do what it needs to do in order to protect its civilian population. Protecting freedom of worship on a holy site means ensuring that a holy site is used for worship and not used as a staging ground for terror attacks and for political violence.
Switching gears here, at the same time, we talked about Netanyahu's Rafah operation, or the plans for the Rafah operation. They're already talking about the Netanyahu plan for the day after the war, and I'm kind of hesitant to discuss it because we're in the midst of a war, but the whole world wants to know what's going to happen the day after the war. So the prime minister this past Thursday formally presented for the first time his day after Hamas plan. Netanyahu envisions the IDF maintaining full operational freedom in Gaza indefinitely, as well as establishing a buffer zone along the border to protect southern communities. The military will act to ensure that the Strip remains demilitarized. Also, an IDF presence of some sort along what is known as the Philadelphia corridor, that is the route between the border between Egypt and Gaza. So that is part of his plan. We're not going to get into everything, all the details in terms of the day after the war. One thing that is missing, and some people were saying that Israel perhaps should reconsider reestablishing some of the Jewish communities that were taken down as everyone was evicted from their homes, all the Jews in 2005. That does not look like to be in any way, shape, or form part of this plan, and a lot of people might be upset by that. But what's your take on Netanyahu's plan? The continuous, it's almost like Judea and Samaria. That's what it seems to me, that Israel will have maintained the right, as has been the case since around 2005, to go into the villages in Judea and Samaria, on a nightly basis and root out terrorism, take care of those ticking time bomb attacks, those who are on their way to carry out attacks. Israel does have operational freedom, and that's really the difference. That has been the difference between the situation in Gaza and the situation in Judea and Samaria. You can even argue that that's the reason why October 7th was able to happen, because Israel did not have boots on the ground. It looks like Netanyahu wants to put boots on the ground permanently, at least in the near future, as long as Gaza remains somewhat of a threat.
So the reason why Netanyahu was forced to reveal this plan is because of significant pressure by the United States when they're asking what is the plan for the day after. And I think that some of the key components of this plan is, number one, that Hamas is not going to be governing the Strip on the day after, according to Netanyahu's plan. Number two, the Palestinian Authority is not going to be governing the Gaza Strip on the day after the war. And we have to remember that the Palestinian Authority was gifted control of the Gaza Strip in 2005 when Israel evacuated from the Gaza Strip, and it took them less than 2 years to be completely overthrown by Hamas, both through elections and through violent expulsion by Hamas. So Israel's saying that the Palestinian Authority is not going to be part of the rulership of Gaza in the day after, which flies in the face of what the Biden administration wants. They want some reformed version of the Palestinian Authority to take control of Gaza on the day after. And Israel's saying that there's going to be local control in which local Gazans that are not affiliated with Hamas or any other terror organization are going to be identified and empowered to run the rebuilding efforts. Now, Israel's also talking about moderate Arab states, including potentially the Saudis and the Emiratis and Bahrain, putting money towards the rebuilding of Gaza. It's not clear whether they have agreed to that before or after or as part of this plan, but that Israel also is going to have a role in overseeing the efforts to make sure also that any aid that does come in to rebuild Gaza goes toward rebuilding Gaza. And all this concrete, for example, that was allowed into Gaza leading up to October 7th, it was all diverted to build this terror tunnel network. So Israel has to make sure that it has full security control over the entire area, as you mentioned, and also is going to be supervising the rebuilding effort.
A sad but perfect example of how the Palestinian Authority can't be entrusted is the fact that on Thursday, an Israeli man was killed, 6 others wounded in a terrorist attack just outside of Jerusalem on the Ma'ale Adumim Jerusalem Highway, Highway 1. One Israeli murdered.
I think 11 others were injured, including a pregnant woman.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. A pregnant woman who was injured. I think she's in stable condition. I don't know the status of her baby at this point, but it just shows you, number one, first of all, 3 terrorists carried this out. They came from a PA-controlled area near Bethlehem and made their way to the Ma'ale Adumim area and opened fire on cars who were stuck in the traffic jam.
I think that one of the interesting things to recognize about this terror attack is where it took place. And it took place at a checkpoint on the entrance to Jerusalem. And these checkpoints they get a lot of flack from the international community. Now, the way this works is that not all Arab residents living in what's called the West Bank and the Palestinian-controlled areas have access to go into Israeli cities like Jerusalem. So Israel has set up checkpoints, which are essentially like toll booths on the entrance of Jerusalem, where you don't have to pay, but you get checked by Israeli security. And so what has happened, especially since October 7th, is that the terrorists have identified the checkpoint themselves as as a good venue for committing acts of terror. We've seen it in the past. We've seen a lot of car rammings at checkpoints and other things. But now what's happening is that Arabs that have automatic weapons are basically just driving into the traffic jams, and they're waiting until there's a lot of cars in front of them, and then until cars build up behind them, and then they're just stuck in the middle of the traffic jam, and they get out of their cars with assault rifles, and they start firing at unsuspecting Jews that are sitting in the traffic, and there's just nowhere for them to go.
This happened recently in Gush Etzion. One of the guards at the checkpoint was murdered by an Arab terrorist. It also happened I think it's been about a year now in the village of Hawara, which is a hotbed for Arab terrorism, where people got stuck in a traffic jam, and terrorists came out from the sides of the roads or came out of their cars and shot at Israelis. But the point here is that the Palestinian Authority, they're the ones in charge. They're the ones who continue to incite to violence and to incite to murder. So if we're talking about the PA coming in and taking control of Gaza, I think that's a terrible mistake. Number one, they don't have the ability. Even if they didn't direct this specific attack, they don't have the ability to maintain control. We saw that, as you mentioned before, in 2005. That's why they were booted out of there by Hamas in violent riots in 2000.
Well, unlike Hamas, the Palestinian Authority actually has U.S. trained police forces, about 50,000 people, and the United States international community have given them assault rifles. They have guns. They have M16s and the like, and there's been, in addition to that, just a tremendous smuggling effort to get guns into Judea and Samaria. In 2014, for example, we had the car ramming and the stabbing intifada, and now you don't see stabbing intifada anymore. Now you see assault rifle intifada, and it's a much, much more dangerous situation. And the big fear here is that violence could start to spill over in Judea and Samaria, in Jerusalem, and other areas where Hamas or other radicalized groups have significant presence. And when you mix ideology and incitement with assault rifles, you get a lot of dead Jews.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we gave them the arms and the training that was part of the Oslo Accords back in the 90s, and it turned out to bite us in the back, if you will. I mean, I remember back in the year 2000, one of the first Israelis who was murdered in what was known as the Second Intifada was an IDF patrolman who went on a patrol with his PA counterpart, and the PA counterpart took his U.S. rifle and aimed it at him, turned the gun on him. They were supposed to fight Hamas. They never fought Hamas. The Palestinian Authority never fought Hamas. They may not love each other, but when it comes to the destruction of Israel, whether it's Hamas's version doing it all at once or the PA's version doing it in stages, they certainly are on the same page.
Also important to know that if there would be elections today in the Palestinian Authority, and there's been polls that demonstrate this, Hamas would win.
Yes, absolutely. Hamas would win. And you can expect, if you let them take control, you can expect Gaza, God forbid, Gaza, to come to Judea and Samaria with Hamas taking control, overlooking our strategic cities where 75% of the Israeli population lives between Gadara and Hadera on the strategic highlands. It would be a terrible, terrible mistake. It would be October 7th every day if the Hamas was controlling the overlooks over Ben Gurion Airport, over Tel Aviv, over those areas. It would be a threat of October 7th each and every day. Switching gears to the north now, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced that Israel has the intention to escalate its strikes on Hezbollah, irrelevant of a Gaza ceasefire. So again, you had this simultaneous, and you do have now simultaneous attacks. There were several rockets being launched in the south, actually, this morning at Kisufim and at Re'im by Hamas from Gaza. And it's almost around the clock. You have rockets being fired by Hezbollah agents in the north. Israel has taken steps and has eliminated, I think it's several hundred Hezbollah members. But now it looks, according to the defense minister, regardless of what happens in the south, Israel is going to take a stronger approach to the situation in the north.
Well, just this morning, Hezbollah fired a missile at Israel that was targeting an area near Afua by Har Tavor, which is already a very significant distance inside Israel. And this is the big fear, that a lot of Hezbollah weaponry is long range, much of it precision guided. And the feeling in Israel is that a diplomatic solution is not going to be reached. Now, Israel's paying a lot of lip service to the idea of a diplomatic solution. They're giving the U.S. and France and others the opportunity to get Hezbollah to move itself back, 10 kilometers north of the border with Israel, which would take Israel out of range of especially the anti-tank guided missiles, which Hezbollah has been using, and it would lower the chances of an October 7th style attack where you'd have thousands of operatives storming across the border. Until that happens, they're not going to feel safe to return about 80,000 residents who have been evacuated from that 5-kilometer area south of the Lebanese border. So on the one hand, they're giving the opportunity for the international community to try to reach a diplomatic agreement. At the same time, not convinced that that's going to happen. And not only are they prepared to remove Hezbollah from southern Lebanon by force if they have to, but they're saying at this point that they are going to continue to raise the stakes and attack with greater and greater force. And even if there's a ceasefire, as you said, in Gaza, that's not going to prevent Israel from operating against Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Alex, I've seen over the last couple of weeks, you've been adamant that you believe that Israel, in fact, is going to launch a major military operation, call it a war if you'd like, in the north, regardless of what's going on down south. I think you've said it several times. You've made that prediction very, very public.
Well, the situation continues to heat up, right? And as long as you have so many residents that aren't in their homes, I mean, where are they going to stay? Right now, they're in hotels, they're in guest houses. Israel has a responsibility to their citizens to provide basic security to live in their homes, and right now they can't do that. This is an opportunity that Israel has to take out Hamas, to take out Hezbollah. The Israeli government's worried about it. They don't think that a war with Hezbollah will be a walk in the park. They think that it could be a significant threat to the home front. Remember, the war with Hamas, we had a bad day on October 7th, over 1,200 people killed, thousands injured. But since October 7th, the threat to the Israeli home front was contained. There hasn't been other attacks, with the exception of all the Qassam rockets that Israel manages to shoot out of the sky. You just haven't seen people getting killed inside Israel. There's definitely the threat that if there's a war with Hezbollah, that you could see many, many more attacks on the Israeli home front than we saw in the war with Hamas.
We're nearly out of time. One more topic here, and obviously, I'd love to talk about sports and weather. It would be great if there was nothing else going on in the news.
Sunny today.
Yeah, it's sunny after, I think that spring is here. I mean, we can talk a little bit about the weather. I think spring's here. It's heating up outside, and it's also heating up on all our fronts, unfortunately. But former Prime Minister Ehud Barak is at it again. We brought him up last week. This week, he essentially called on Israelis to besiege the Knesset. Former Prime Minister Barak called on Israelis to protest the government and demand action for the various government missteps, calling on the public to besiege the Knesset, quote, besiege the Knesset on a Sunday morning. He said that there should be just a daily bombardment of demonstrations and all kinds of I'm not going to say riots, but all kinds of demonstrations at the Knesset, where the public should come out and every member of Israeli society should take to the streets and cause mayhem for or against the current government.
So Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was first prime minister in the 90s. At the end of almost 3 years in office, there was an election, and he was defeated by Ehud Barak. Okay, Barak lasted in office for almost the shortest term of any prime minister, less than 2 years. Even after his government fell apart, he still offered the Palestinian Authority a state. He didn't necessarily have a mandate to do that, but he had international support to do it, and he did it. Mahmoud Abbas rejected the proposal, so nothing happened with it. But fast forward, Ehud Barak has been the number one instigator of demonstrations against Netanyahu. And here in Israel, we've had 5 elections in a period of less than 5 years. During that time, you had a whole protest movement that started, and Ehud Barak is at the heart of that movement. You had, over last summer, many protests against judicial reform, and Ehud Barak was at the heart of those efforts also to incite the public to come out in the streets. He's been talking about the possibility of Israel going toward a civil war. So very, very dangerous efforts by Ehud Barak, and he keeps it going, and it's very problematic right now because Israelis recognize that the discord and the divisiveness that took place in the years leading up to, and specifically in the months leading up to October 7th, was one of the contributing factors to Israel letting its guard down. Israelis have rallied together since the war started. And I think that most Israelis do want there to be a reckoning among both military and political officials, because ultimately they were the ones who were responsible for allowing intelligence to go unheralded. But most Israelis want this reckoning to take place after the war is over. And there might have been a lot of failures leading up to October 7th. Since October 7th, I think most Israelis will tell you that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his war cabinet, which includes some opposition members, left-wing members, challengers like Benny Gantz, Gadi Eisenkot, and others, have handled the war very responsibly. and it's gone successfully despite a tremendous amount of international pressure. So the idea now that Ehud Barak would be consistently trying to incite Israelis back into the streets, back against the government to revitalize this divisive discourse, it's highly, highly problematic, and it's just another one of the multiple fronts that Benjamin Netanyahu has to navigate, in addition to fighting the war and fighting off the international pressure. There's also a domestic enemy that seeks to divide the country.
Yeah, certainly the time will come in major investigation, the failures leading up to October 7th. But as we say in Hebrew, as has been the motto of the word, B'yachad nenatzeach, together we will win. We have to maintain our unity. That is the only way forward. And that's going to do it for today. Another edition of Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. My name is Josh Hasten, along with JNS CEO Alex Traiman. We are broadcasting to the world from Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. Make sure you check out all of our amazing content, JNS TV on YouTube, and go to the website, jns.org. Thanks so much. Be safe, everyone. Continue to pray for the welfare of the IDF soldiers, the brave men and women who are defending the state of Israel and the Jewish people. And have a great week, everybody.